Today we're going to have a look at water transport in plants. Now we know that everywhere in the plant water is needed and the plant gets its water from the soil surrounding it. Now water will move from the saturated soil particles through the roots, up the stem, into the leaf and then out of the leaf, meaning that there's three main parts that is responsible for the transport of water. That would be the roots, the stem and the leaves, with an overall movement upwards of water. This means that certain processes need to be in place to overcome the power of gravity to be able to transport the water upwards. So first we'll have a look at the roots and how water is taken up and transported through the roots. So here is a simple diagram of how the dissection of a dicotyledon root looks. Now remember, the soil is saturated with water particles, meaning that there's a high water potential outside of the root and a low water potential inside the root. The water will then move through one of the root hairs into the cortex cells of the root and then go from cortex cell to cortex cell until it reaches the xylem cells in the center of the root at the vascular bundle. We're going to have a closer look at this process. So if we go and we imagine the cells connecting the root hair all the way to the xylem vessels, remember these will be cortex cells. So there's a high water potential, and this is the sign for water potential outside of the root, and there will be a low water potential inside the root hair cell. So water will move from a high water potential to a low water potential down the water potential gradient into the root hair cell. This will saturate the root hair cell, and now the root hair cell will have a high water potential, meaning that the next cell, the cortex cell, will have a low water potential. Water will then move from a high water potential to a low water potential into the cortex cell. So this process we know as osmosis, and this process will continue from cell to cell to cell until it reaches the xylem cell. Now remember, as the water moves from one cell to another, it depletes the water from the previous cell, making that cell a low water potential cell again, and more water will come from the soil into that cell. Now that we've discussed how water moves from the saturated soil up through the roots, we need to discuss the second critical part of the plant that's responsible for water movement, and that would be the leaves. So here is a typical dissection of a leaf under a microscope. So there's several different cells that we need to be aware of. So the first one is the epidermal cells. These are the cells at the top and the bottom. These plants are responsible for protecting the plant from the external environment. They also secrete certain substances known as the cuticle, which is a waxy layer that protects the plant from water loss and also entry by pathogens. They then also contain the stomata, which is responsible for gas exchange. That means it allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to either enter or exit the leaf. Next, we have the mesophyll cells, and these include the spongy mesophyll as well as the palisade mesophyll. Now, palisade mesophyll is always found at the top part of the leaf, and that's because they're responsible for photosynthesis. They contain a lot of chloroplasts and lay just beneath the see-through epidermal layer. The spongy mesophyll is then found at the bottom part of the leaf, and you'll see that there's a lot of air spaces in between the spongy mesophyll, and that is because the spongy mesophyll is responsible for gas exchange. Some studies have also shown that the spongy mesophyll can be used as a temporary storage for sugars and amino acids that have been produced by the palisade layer through photosynthesis and other processes. Then, of course, we have our vascular bundle, which we already covered in the previous video. So here on the top part of the vascular bundle will be our phloem, and the bottom part of our vascular bundle will be our xylem. Now, water will move out of the xylem into one of the spongy mesophyll cells. Now, this process will be through osmosis, so from a high water potential to a low water potential. Then to the next spongy mesophyll cell, again from a high water potential to a low water potential through osmosis. Now here is where it gets tricky. The water will then move from the spongy mesophyll cell into an air space, and this process will be through evaporation. This is because water will go from a liquid state to a gas state. And then when the water moves from this air space out of the stomata to the outside of the leaf, this process will be through diffusion. And the reason for this is because there's no semi-permeable membrane, meaning that osmosis cannot occur. So through diffusion, gas exchange will happen. Now through this process, the plant kind of creates a sucking force, sucking the water out from the xylem and transporting it to the outside of the plant. We call this a negative pressure that's being produced because the pressure of water is being decreased at the roots, meaning that more water will be sucked up by the roots to be transported. Now it kind of seems silly because nowhere in this process did I ever mention that water is being used for anything. But as water moves through the plants, the cells that need it will use it. Most of the water, although, will be transported and then evaporated out of the leaf. This is to keep the turgidity and stiffness of the plant, as well as the continuous movement of water throughout the plant, so that all the cells can have some. Now let's have a bit of a closer look at the stomata and how it functions. So this is kind of how it would look if you look at the bottom of a leaf through a microscope. So surrounding the stomata, we'll see the top parts of our epidermal cells. And remember, our epidermal cells are there to protect our plant and is kind of see-through. Then we have our stomata. Our stomata is made up of two guard cells that are bean-shaped. These guard cells are able to open and close through the movement of water into and out of them. So if water moves from the epidermal cells into the guard cells will become turgid, pushing away from each other and creating an opening in the middle. This means that if the plant has a lot of water, it will open the stomata and let some water escape the stomata out of the plant. Now, if water goes from the guard cells out into the epidermal cells, the guard cells will lose turgidity and move closer together and then close the gap between them, closing the stomata. This means that as soon as the plant needs water to survive, especially in dry conditions, then the stomata will close and less water will be able to escape through the stomata, and the plant will keep the water inside of it where it needs it the most. So now we have had a look at how roots suck up water and transports them to the xylem, and how leaves takes water from the xylem and then releases it through the stomata to create a negative pressure in the roots. So now let's have a look at the xylem in the stem and how water is transported up the plant between the roots and the leaves. So here we can see the basic structure of a xylem vessel. We can see that there's no end walls or cross walls in between the cells, and the walls of the vessel are thickened with linen. Now, water is removed from the leaf, and this process we call transpiration. Now, as water is removed from the leaf, it creates the pull factor inside of the xylem vessels. So as water leaves the leaf, tension is created and water starts moving up the xylem vessels. Now, this continuous movement of water up xylem vessels is called the transpiration stream. You guys should not get confused between transpiration, which is the loss of water through the leaf, through the stomata, and transpiration stream, which is the pull factor of water and continuous movement of water up the xylem vessel. There's some other factors that also play a role in the continuous movement of water up the xylem vessel. So let's have a closer look at the forces between the water molecules and the xylem vessel. So between the water molecules and the xylem walls is a force that is called cohesion, which makes the water molecules attracted to the wall of the xylem vessel. And then between the water molecules themselves is a force that's called adhesion, which makes the water molecules attracted to each other, making them stick together. So let me explain these forces in a little bit more detail. Let's imagine a water molecule. A water molecule is made up of an oxygen molecule as well as two hydrogen molecules. Now, the oxygen molecule is slightly negatively charged and the hydrogen molecules are slightly positive charged. Imagine this like different poles on a magnet. So if we have other water molecules, then opposite poles will attract each other and the same poles will push each other away. So the negative oxygen atom will be attracted to other positively charged hydrogen atoms, and this will keep them together. And of course, the hydrogen atoms will be attracted to the negatively charged oxygen atoms, which would also keep them together. And this is cohesion. Now, in the walls of the xylem vessels are also different types of chemicals with different charges, either positive charges or negative charges. Now, if there are positive charges in the walls, that means that the oxygen atoms will be attracted because the oxygen atoms are negatively charged. So negative will be attracted to positive. If there's negative charges in the walls of the xylem vessel, then the positively charged hydrogen atoms will be attracted to these charges because opposite charges attract. Now this is called adhesion. So all of these forces, the transpiration, which is the water loss through the stomata out of the leaf, which creates a negative pressure as well as a pulling effect of water, as well as the forces between the water molecules, which is called adhesion, as well as the forces between the water molecules and the xylem vessel called cohesion. All of these forces will help pull the water upwards. They all create the continuous stream of water up the plant.